Okay. Perfect. Okay, so let's start by first looking at where you can find the tutorial documents, the supporting material, the supporting documents for the course. You can find everything on my website, which you can find at the web address that probably you can see in the address bar here. It's just www, which you can also skip, albertomontanari.it. So it's very simple. The tutorial documents can be found also on Virtuale. Let me open Virtuale. Basically, Virtuale should be a mirror on my website. I use the conditional should be because in my intention should be a mirror. But if you see any difference, because sometimes I update my website and I make an effort to also update Virtuale, but sometimes, you know, I may forget something. And so if you see any difference, let me know. So in Virtuale, of course, we look for Harbour Engineering. It is called Harbour Engineering and Geotechnics, or Harbour Engineering. The right link to click is this one that you can see on the screen. And here you can see everything. As I said, it should be a copy of my website. Actually, it should readdress to my website. For instance, if we click here on guidelines for a successful learning and exam, you should get to a page where there is explained that we work through links to the teacher's website, and then we get back to my website. Okay, and actually this link is not really correct, so we need to check the link on Virtuale. But in any case, the moral of the story is that you can find everything that you need on both sides. In particular, in Virtuale, I suggest you to subscribe if you didn't. Let me just check if there are some students subscribed in Virtuale. So there is only another one, so you are not there. So I suggest you to subscribe because I prefer to use Virtuale when I have to deliver communications or any information, any additional information related to the subject. And I use this link announcements, which brings us to the forum, and there is no news because I didn't write anything yet so far. And in any case, I will use this communication channel to deliver any information that may be needed. Now, you may wonder why I have this mirror. So why I'm providing the tutorials on two channels. The reason is that my website is open, Virtuale is not open. Virtuale is open only to students of the University of Bologna. And my target on the other end is to make the educational information completely open, completely available, so that it remains available to you even after the closure of your university career. And if you need any additional information during your future, you may refer to my website, which is continuously under development. I make an effort to update the web pages, to update the scientific information related to my courses as soon as new innovation and new results, changes in any procedure become available. So the will of being completely open is the motivation that brought me to open the website. There is also to say that I started by making everything available regarding my lectures, like the supporting documents, the videos, 10 years ago already. At that time, the university didn't have any website that could have been used by professors in order to share the documents with the students. the exchanges were done by paper or by email. So this is another motivation, actually. I started 10 years ago, and then now I have this system of connecting, this way of seeking a connection with the students that works really well. So this is why you can find everything on my website. But on the other hand, in Virtuale, you may find something more, like there might be some self-evaluation tests, which I prefer to keep on Virtuale and not on my website, because these are it's private information, confidential information. So I don't want to put this confidential information into an open website. Anyway, during the lectures, I will let you know if and where you can find additional information. But for now, let's assume that we make reference to my website. It is organized in 2 columns, teaching and research. You look at teaching, and if you scroll down, you see the tutorials of Harbour Engineering 2023. And by clicking here, you get to the introductory page, which can be reached, of course, also through Virtuale. And this introductory page reports all the information that you need in order to attend the course and take the exam. And so the first hour of today's lecture will be dedicated to providing to you this information in an oral form, in a spoken form, because I want to make sure that everything is explained in detail. I want to make sure that all the details regarding the articulation of our interaction are perfectly known. Good. So I am starting, and as I said, for the first hour, this will be our topic of conversation. There is no need to take notes, I think, because there is the video, and which I will make available soon, as I will say. And there is also the web page that is reporting more or less the same thing. Now, this is a course, the one that I am teaching, that is articulated along 32 hours of lectures, as you know. And there will be other 16 hours delivered by Professor Archetti. And now, if we look at the details, I plan to teach 6 hours, about 6 hours, focusing on exercises. Exercises means that we will have computations to make regarding a design, a very simple design problem. We will not have the time to go into the fine details of a final project, of an executive project. On the other hand, I really want to develop with you some applications for 2 reasons. First, we are studying engineering, and therefore, of course, we need also to keep in mind that we need to focus on applications. And by developing an applications, I think that we will have the opportunity to see what are the problems that we may experience when we want to apply the theory that we learned. So, of course, there is a purely educational purpose in developing education to technical design. And the second motivation for developing practical exercises is that I am planning to develop these exercises by programming, by computer programming, which means that we will have to write our own code, and we will not have to use a commercial software, a software that is already built up. I think that it is very useful, very beneficial for you to make an experience of coding, writing a code, because today it is something that we tend to forget. The reason is that there is a proliferation of software on the web for doing almost everything we need. And therefore, there is this trend towards forgetting how computer programming works. And I think this is not a good thing, because actually being able to write codes, we end up with an improved efficiency in our job, engineering job. And I think efficiency is extremely important. Nowadays, there is competition, which is a good thing, because competition brings to improving, elevating the level of our knowledge and our efficiency. On the other hand, of course, competition requires that we are dedicated, we are efficient. And efficiency means, among the other things, that we can complete jobs in a reduced time, which is a good thing, because we can save time for recovering from the effort that our job requires. And efficiency means that we can identify the quickest solution in order to complete a job. I believe that it's possible to work excellently and quickly, but we need to know what are the means that we can use, what are the tools that we can use. And the coding, sometimes with respect to using a software that is already pre-prepared, is more efficient, is quicker. At least because any software needs to be learned. And therefore, if what we need is very specific, it's something that is not very complex, it is most of the times it is quicker to write your own code instead of learning a software which has been designed for completing a lot of different computation, different things, and therefore learning how to make our specific computation requires time. So I think coding is a good experience. And also I anticipate that I want to introduce a free software for coding, because I am a fan of open teaching, open software, open research, open publishing, because I really think that being open today is a necessity. It is a necessity if we really want to be inclusive, if we really want to be interdisciplinary, because relying on commercial softwares is leading unavoidably to subdivision in compartments of research. Each discipline uses its own software. Communication is not easy. The open information and the open software allows an easier communication between different disciplines and different contexts. Also keep in mind that it is widely recognized, especially when talking about oceans today, that diversity and inclusivity is essential. It is essential to open the scientific community to scientists from countries all over the world, with no distinction between developed countries, developing countries. It's a distinction that doesn't have any meaning. And in order to be very inclusive, of course, if we want to join in the same cooperation countries that have a lot of means, a lot of background in computation and digitalization. And we want also to include countries that have a reduced background in terms of digitalization. Of course, using open information reduces the barriers. Okay, so 6 hours to exercises. Basically, I will not start today. Maybe already next week, or maybe in 2 weeks from now, I will start by teaching theory, let's call it this way, theory 2 hours and exercises 2 hours. Good. Now, what is the purpose of this course? We are focusing on, of course, Harbour Engineering. Harbour Engineering focuses in turn on the design of harbors and ports. You can use harbor and port with as synonyms. Actually, harbor can be natural. The port is not natural usually. In some articulation of the English language, you can call port even a natural wharf or a natural pier. but usually, let's say that we can use harbor and ports as synonyms. We are focusing then on the design of wharfs, of pier. We are focusing on mooring forces, design of mooring points, and mooring lines for boats, for ships. We will also have a little focus on coastal engineering because ports, harbors are located, of course, along the coasts, and it is therefore frequently necessary to associate to harbor design the design of coastal protections. So this is why we will also focus on coastal protections. And you can look at the images of several ports and you will see that they are protected by coastal protections because, you know, the coast is an environment that is continuously evolving. And therefore, if we want to include in the coast infrastructure like a port that is that needs to be placed in a context that doesn't change its morphology much. So if we have, for instance, sediment transport, this could cause problems to the ports. And therefore, we need to associate to the construction of the port the realization of infrastructures that in a way stabilize the coastline, make it more stable during time. In a way, they block the natural evolution of the coastline. And this infrastructure have an impact. The port has an impact. So we will also focus on environmental impact and environmental changes and sustainability of the port development. So this is basically our subject. Usually I make an effort to seek an interaction with the students. Actually, if the number of students is reduced, I was expecting that because for some reason after the pandemics, there has been a different displacement of students in the degree programs of engineering. And I was expecting a reduced number of students. Of course, the interaction is not that easy. On the other hand, let's keep in mind that I am open to it. I'm really open. So I will frequently, if there is the opportunity, I will frequently ask you if you have any question. And also keep in mind that it's possible. In the past, it was a very nice experience, especially in Harbour Engineering. It's possible for students to cooperate to teaching by delivering short presentations. Usually this is done by each student just one time, and it's not compulsory. It is interesting because if there is an audience, it is an interesting experience. It's like a training to deliver a presentation. And the presentation shouldn't be focused on what we are studying here, because I am the teacher, I'm supposed to teach. I'm not asking you to teach. On the other hand, it is interesting if you have any case study, any particular interest that you want to present, it's an interesting opportunity. These presentations are short, usually about 10 minutes, and are delivered through a PowerPoint, through slides. And usually they stimulate a good discussion between the students. So again, I'm not sure if we will have an attendance this year, but just let's keep in mind that this is possible. I am scrolling down in my web page, and let's talk now about the tutorial documents. Here is a provisional list. The tutorials are given in the form of links to web pages or links to interactive web pages. In this case, for now, there are only classical web pages. So you may wonder why web pages. I decided already, I think in 2015, to give up with the production of tutorials in PDF, and I passed to writing directly on the web my tutorials. This is, in my opinion, an advantage because we can use links very easily, and links are, in my vision, in my perspective, in my teaching, are extremely important. You will see a lot of links in my web pages. The links, they are not a matter for the exam. They are not delivering information for the exam. The links are placed there to give to students the opportunity to expand their interests, to get additional information, if they think that it is useful, if they are attracted by it. And the links may allow you to provide definitions. If you read something, a terminology that you don't know, there is the link. If you don't know the meaning of the term, there might be a link to get the definition of it. The additional information, in my opinion, it is extremely important because I want to give to students the opportunity to navigate through a subject. And I don't want to build barriers that are dictated by my interpretation of the subject. I really would like that these links give to you the opportunity to go beyond my interpretation and to explore additional aspects of the topic we are discussing. Again, once again, let's start talking about the exam. For the exam, the things that you need to study are those that are written on the web pages, in the tutorial documents. You don't need to follow the links. I would say that it's also impossible to follow the links. And basically, then just keep the link as an additional piece of information. Now, this list of lectures, it's still provisional. There might be something disappearing from here. There might be something that comes in. I am sure that there is a lecture that is already being prepared. I am preparing it. I am finalizing it these days. This will be included regarding the resonance in Harbour Basin. It's not yet here. So the moral is that don't take this list as the final one. And then in terms of practical exercises, there is also another list of links. And this additional list of links is again provisional. So maybe that we use some of them, not all of them. I'm not sure that we will also discuss in terms of theory some of these exercises. So, for instance, if we don't discuss about beach morphology or harbor morphology, morphological evolution, I mean, which is a possible topic, it's this link here. I'm not sure we will discuss it. I need to see who is attending. I need to see if the students already had some experience of studying beach hydrodynamics and morphodynamics. And so if we don't have time, or if we prefer to drop it, we will drop this link, and of course, the link related to the exercise, which is this one. So everything is still provisional. Now, the videos. I started 10 years ago to record the videos of my lectures, and at that time there was no alternative other than putting them on YouTube. And it was okay. And I'm still putting my videos on YouTube because it's open. YouTube, unfortunately, started a couple of years ago to put advertisements on the videos, even if they are not monetized. Of course, my videos are not monetized. In fact, I could benefit from the removal of any advertisement until 2 years ago. 2 years ago, YouTube changed its policy. Now they are putting advertisements everywhere, but they should be very short because I'm not monetizing the videos. I apologize for that, but I think that still it is worth putting everything also on YouTube because I think it is more accessible and more efficient. But I put a copy of the videos also on Virtuale, on Panopto. So if you go on Virtuale, you will see after today that the Panopto collection of the videos on Harbour Engineering will start to become populated. So you can refer to YouTube or Panopto. If you don't want advertisement, Panopto is better. If you want if you don't mind advertisements and you prefer a quicker access because you don't have to log in, you can go on YouTube. The calendar of the lectures is the one that you can see here. We have 32 hours. I'm teaching continuously 4 hours just once a week. And so we will meet 8 times, and we should be able to close the lectures on April 19, which it is quite early. I am checking whether it's possible also to make at least my part of the exam after the end of the lectures and before the formal end of the lecture calendar of the School of Engineering, which is June 9. In the past, I was not allowed to. In principle, I'm still not allowed, but I am trading with the school in order to be able to make a pre-exam in May because the students are asking me on this opportunity. So lecture time will be more or less 2:10 and up to 5:25 with only one break of 15 minutes between 3:45 to 4. If you want, I can make also more breaks. It's not really a problem for me. Usually with the students, we feel comfortable with one break so we can close the lectures a little bit in advance. It also depends on how the lectures goes. If there are a lot of discussions, a lot of questions, there is less need for a break. If the lecture is very intensive, very condensed, then maybe, but we can also decide on the fly, okay? If you have any need and would like, for instance, to start before then 2, I think I could check if the room is available because it's not a problem. It wouldn't be a problem also for me to start at 1:30. Anyway, let's stick on this lecture time. And if you have any need or any proposal for a change, we can discuss it. Okay, so about the exam. The exam is oral, just oral. It's not a long one. Usually my exam lasts for about 15, 20 minutes. And it may be half an hour if, in some particular cases, if the student is good, it's about 15, 20 minutes. And usually I ask 3-4 questions. The first one is a narrative question. Usually there is a lot of narrative in this subject, as you will see. Of course, there are also a lot of technical parts, but there is a good piece of narrative here because we also need to understand in Harbour Engineering the natural environment. We need to understand the natural processes. And this is, I think, best done through a perceptual approach. So before then passing to the maths, nature is described by physics, chemistry, several scientific disciplines that make a large use of maths. But before, I mean, the math, I think, requires, in order to be understood, a preliminary comprehension of the natural process. And comprehension of the natural process means making sure that through a narrative, that we get a good perception of all the mechanisms that are involved, the links, feedbacks, interactions between different processes. So the first question then, in terms of the exam, will be very frequently a narrative question. And narrative means that you will have to speak about 10 minutes describing a problem, describing a subject, describing a part of what we are studying together. And this first question allows me to assess your ability to speak, which I think is an important component of your education, of your preparation. I really would like to make sure that students have good communication skills, because this is what is then evaluated in the job market. I mean, it's not only your final mark of the degree that matters. I would say that it's a detail, it's a side information. What an employer usually evaluates when seeks to fill a position is the attitude of the person, the commitment to work, the dedication, the passion, and also the ability to speak. And other abilities like ability to team working, ability to seek compromise. And these are communication skills. I'm not entering into the details because in the first lecture I will focus on these skills, because I really want to emphasize and to make the students aware that when building your education, of course, you have to pass exams. So you have to study also for passing the exam. But what I really want to convince a student to do is to make an effort also to study for building your CV, building your education. And it's something that goes beyond studying for the exam. So this is why I evaluate your ability to speak. And then the other questions, 2, 3 questions that follow, usually are more technical and are quick questions. Okay. Now, keep in mind that the highest score, which is 30, is reserved to students who demonstrate series of things. First of all, a good knowledge of the notions. Second, a good perception of the problem. And because this is important for an engineer, it is essential. So an engineer must be very practical and should be able to integrate in the best way theory and practice. So good knowledge means good knowledge of the theory, but this must be associated to a good knowledge also of the practice. And basically, the highest mark is reserved for students who demonstrate a good knowledge of the theory, a good perception of the problem, and a good ability to speak. Then, what about the laude? The laude, to me, is something exceptional. Usually, about 5% of the students take the laude in my exams, and this is usually what the university recommends. And exceptional, what does this mean? Because this is a good question, actually. Exceptional means that besides being a very good student, besides having a good knowledge of the theory, a good knowledge of the problem, a good ability to speak, the student, for some reason, stands up. And the reasons may be an excellent enthusiasm and an excellent passion, which is demonstrated by maybe the fact that the student got additional information, followed the links, and the students demonstrates that during the preparation of the exam, additional information was collected in order to satisfy an ambition, to satisfy a curiosity, a curiosity-driven motivation. This is what makes a student standing out. And in this case, the student may deserve the laud. When the exam will be made, first, I plan to give 3 opportunities to make the exam before summer. If I'll be allowed to make the exam in May, the first exam will be in May, and then an exam in June, and then an exam in July, with the aim of making the last one before summer around July 15. And then there will be a 4th opportunity in September, and 2 more opportunities during the break between the first semester and the second semester of the next year. So maybe 2 exams in January and February 24. My plan is to make about 6. The exams will be in Ravenna, if possible. I say if possible because sometimes it's a bit of a problem for me because I am also teaching 2 courses in Bologna. So during the exam time, it's sometimes I have some conflicts. So maybe in some cases I ask the students to travel to Bologna for taking the exam, but I will make an effort to make it in Ravenna. For most of you, this exam is my part is integrated with other parts, usually taught by Professor Archetti. So if this is your case, just keep in mind that we may make the exam together the same day, but this rarely happens. It is more frequent the case where the students take the exam in 2 different dates. First, one of the 2, like Archetti, and then Montanari later. This is not a problem. The only thing that you have to account for is that we can register the exam on the official books of the university only after the overall set of exams has been completed. In the meantime, after your first exam with, say, Archetti, and while waiting for the second exam by, say, Montanari, in the meantime, there is nothing that is transcripted officially. This is not a big problem for you unless you have to collect credits for some reason. So if you really are hurried to get credits, you should try to complete the whole set of exams as soon as possible. Okay, so I forgot to say that the videos will become available quickly. In the website, there is written 1 week after each lecture. Actually, I think that it's often less than that. I usually make an effort to make it available by the same day, and I'm not always on time, but usually they are quickly available. And if you don't see the videos, after a couple of days, you are allowed to write an email asking, Professor, did you put the video online? I don't forget. But just wait a couple of days because sometimes I am busy and I need to wait, me too. But after a couple of days, usually you will find everything there. Okay, I think that's it. Do you have any questions so far? Of course, questions can come later, but if you have any questions, just let me know.
For the moment, no, Prof.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
I think that we can start. And let's click on the first link. Before starting, give me a couple of minutes because I have a urgent email to be sent out, but just a couple of minutes, just 1 second. Okay, so the first lecture, the first link is a premise. And it's a premise that it is more philosophical than technical, but I just wanted to clarify what is my view, my perspective, my vision for teaching in general, for teaching engineering in particular. And what I already talked about is interactivity, which I think it is an essential piece of education. It is an essential component of education. So I will do my best in order to seek interaction. And because I think, as I said, it's an essential ingredient. And another thing that I want to emphasize is that I think education changed a lot in the past 10 years. And it changed also after the pandemics, but it was already changing and starting from, I would say 20 years ago, after the web, after internet became widely accessible. The fact that internet became widely accessible implied that the source of information for education changed because the main reference up to 20 years ago for education, which was given by books, was progressively dropping in efficiency in delivering the required information. And internet started taking over. So during the years, more and more, progressively, we professors made an increasing reference to the web for delivering information and education. And the reason is very simple, because, you know, I think change is a keyword of our time. Now, things are changing and the socioeconomic setting is changing with a pace that it is really impressive. I think it is a good thing. On the other hand, it really requires an effort to keep up to date. And keep up to date means that you have continuously the need of updating the information that you use for your everyday life. And books actually are too static, in my view, to compete with the space, with this changing, continuously changing setting. The web is competing. The web is competing because it's open and it gives a lot of opportunities to deliver information. And it is impressive how we changed our way of getting informed about everything after the advent of the web. And it was only 20 years ago. So it is a problem. It is a problem because the web is so large that it's not easy for a professor to distill the information. In the past, it was much easier. Usually for any university subject, we were used to have a book or a PDF that was available, made available, a manual that was a real book that was made available by the professor, self-made, but more frequently a book. The book usually was like 20 years old. Young books were 20 years old. We were also using books that were published 50 years before. And it was not a problem. It was very easy to give these books, to suggest these books to the students. They were like pillars of education. I remember some historic books, very masterpieces. They are masterpieces that were supporting the education in structural mechanics, for instance, in hydraulics. And these books today are not much used because today we are used to consider a piece of information that is 10 years old as outdated. When we look at the scientific papers, for instance, when we look for something about environmental restoration, if we see a date like 2010, we think it's too old because many things changed meanwhile. And another excellent example is climate change. Climate change, if you look at the information of 2010, it's outdated. So many things were discovered after that. So it is indeed a bit of a problem to distill the information from the web. And I think for a student who is approaching a so complex environment like the university in different subjects, because for me it's relatively easier. My subject is very focused. But for students, it is a bit of a problem. So I think that it is indeed useful to provide the information through the web, to give example on how the web should be searched. And then what are the skills? The skills that I believe are important for a student. Okay, we can refer to Wikipedia. Wikipedia, you see here on the screen, there is a link to the 21st century skills. Let's try to click on it. And you see that there is a Wikipedia page, a full Wikipedia page that describes what the institutions and what the academia today think are the fundamental skills to be taught to the students. And here there is a figure, if you click here, which is copied in my web page, which I think it is very nice because it reflects my perspective. And this is not an information that I'm providing for the exam. And of course, this is an introduction. So don't worry, this is not something that has to be studied, of course. But on the other hand, I really want to just to mention these skills, which are related to 3 columns: learning and innovation, the 4 C's, digital literacy, and career and life. So about learning and innovation, critical thinking and problem solving, and I already spoke about it because I said that solving exercise is important. I already said that coding may help a lot. Being able to code, to write computer codes, may help a lot in improving our capability in problem solving. And then there is creativity and innovation. And creativity is something that I didn't mention when I discussed about what an employer seeks in a potential candidate. Creativity is one of the ingredients that the employers really want to seek. Communication, I already spoke about it, and collaboration. I use the term team working is a synonym of collaboration. And then there is the digital literacy. Literacy means information, ability to delve into the digital libraries, and therefore literacy expertise about information, media, and ICT. ICT is information technology. And this is something that is becoming more and more important. I didn't mention the social media, but I could say that I have a lot of scientific interactions through social media, and I'm firmly convinced that social media are providing an unprecedented opportunity, a very exciting opportunity to get in touch with people. I recently submitted a paper on the drought of the Po River, which is still ongoing, by the way, and the idea came through a Twitter interaction with a set of international experts. And then there is career and life, which are very important. Pay attention to these 5 items: flexibility and adaptability. It is extremely important. This is another key ingredient for a job provider. They really want flexibility. They don't want to change their personnel every time that we experience a change in the market. in the socioeconomic setting. The change is every day today. And initiative and self-direction, so independency and ability to identify and build your own direction for solving a problem. Social and cross-cultural interaction. You may see that some of these skills, some of these items are in a way overlapping a little bit. So cross-cultural interaction and social interaction is overlapping with communication. And then there is productivity and accountability. Productivity, I spoke about efficiency some minutes ago. It is extremely important. And then leadership and responsibility. Leadership is something that is frequently sought, is frequently looked for. And leadership doesn't mean that a person is pretentious or is arrogant. It's a different thing. Leadership means that a person is respected, is able to manage people with a mutual enjoyment, mutual satisfaction, mutual appreciation. And so it's completely different from arrogancy or dogmatic interpretation of the job. So I just wanted to give an introduction on these skills because then I conclude this premise with what I think has been an evolution of teaching in engineering. In the past, we followed this scheme from the top to the bottom. In the past, engineering was taught starting from the theory. So during the first 2 years of my university course in engineering, I studied a lot of mathematics. And then after the theory, we went to models because the theory allows us to build models. And then by using some data, we used the models to simulate scenario in order to estimate design events, design variables. And then from the design variables, we came to the solutions. I think that today we have to adopt a bottom-up approach. We have to focus on the solutions. And in order to identify, to get a preliminary idea of what could be the best solution, we need a lot of perception. So we need to use also perceptual approach. This is why I said this course includes a lot of narrative, because we have to understand how nature works. And then from after our perceptual identification of solutions, then we go back to the design events, to the design forcings, to the models that we need to generate these design forcings, and finally to the theory. This allows us to focus on the technical part of it. And the only inconvenient that we may experience is a progressively decreasing focus on the theory, because actually the conclusion of this scheme should not be that we just need to study the theory that we need, because in this way we would narrow our knowledge. So for instance, let me make an example in mathematics. Everything is integrated numerically nowadays. So when we need to integrate partial differential equations, and we need to do that because several principles of physics are conservation principles, like conservation of mass, conservation of energy. And these conservation principles are expressed in terms of differential equations. So if we want to apply these conservation principles, we need to compute an integral, which is fine, I mean, especially nowadays, because through the computer with numerical integration, it's very easy to compute whatever integral. But this doesn't mean that we can forget about analytical integration, because analytical integration is essential to understand what is an integral and how an integral works. So the fact that we focus on the solution, on the technical part of it, and the fact that we try to be efficient in the study of the theory shouldn't bring us to forget what are essential pieces of the theory that we need to study for the sake of building the contour of our knowledge. And of course, we need the guidance of the university, of the academia, to find the best combination of notions in order to seek a well-covered, comprehensive knowledge and efficiency. So we cannot spend years and years to study. Today, it's not possible. We have to be very quick to find solutions. On the other hand, we shouldn't miss essential pieces of knowledge, because an engineer needs to know mathematics. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time discussing on this, but I think it is important, I feel it is important that you know what is my approach to teaching, what is my approach to Harbour Engineering in this case. And I think that at this stage we can go back to our list of links. And before moving forward, I want to ask you one thing, given that you are alone here. Did you attend with me coastal engineering in the past? Okay. If you are talking, just note that you may be muted. So let me make, I don't think you attended coastal engineering, because let me check again. I don't remember your name. So if you didn't attend coastal engineering, first of all, sorry if I am asking, but there is an intersection of curricula in this degree program, and it's not easy for me to understand who did what. So let's then focus on this lecture, which is, I think, not long, and I think it is useful. So let me, first of all, in this lecture, you can find at the end a link to a PowerPoint presentation. And let's open this PowerPoint presentation. But before that, let me explain what is the meaning of including at the end of the tutorial document a PowerPoint presentation. The meaning is that I want to use the PowerPoint presentation to lecture, because it's not convenient to lecture by reading a full description of the topic, like the web page is, because you cannot concentrate your attention on the key issues. The PowerPoint presentation presents to you the key issue, is a kind of information that is distilled from the web pages. My advice for you is not to use the PowerPoint presentation for studying. What you need to study are the web pages. The PowerPoint presentation may be just good for getting the key issues or for making a verification of your preparation, okay? But in order to deliver the lecture, let me open it. With a couple of clicks, we download the zip file and we can open the lecture. Okay, let me pass in presentation mode. So this premise is related to coastal management and beach design. So it is related to coastal engineering in order to understand in general the context we are focusing on, okay? And first, I would like to draw your attention on the fact that costs are very important. And costs are very important, and represent an environment with an extremely relevant socio-economic and ecological value. The coastal areas occupy less than 15% of the Earth's land surface, but accommodate more than 40% of the world population. So you understand that it's an area with limited extension, but a high population density. And the fact that there is a high population density means that they are extremely important in the socio-economic context. In fact, you can read here, about 1.2 billion people live within 100 kilometers from the coastline and within an elevation of 100 meters above sea level, with an average density along the coastline that it's about 3 times higher than the global average for population. So the socioeconomic importance of coasts is indeed extreme. They are extremely relevant. Let's focus on Italy. In Italy, about 60% of the population lives in coastal area, and about 24% of the population is concentrated in big coastal cities. And keep in mind that during tourism, during the touristic season, this percentage of population living in the coastal cities increases a lot. So these figures tells you that the seashore is an important feature of any country. And also the sea brings a lot of resources like seaborne trade, fishing, tourism, and a lot of commercial activities that are related to tourism. So, what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that we can understand why countries during the human history have always fought to gain an access to the sea, because access to the sea is fundamental for the development of these activities that are connected to the sea, to the ocean. And in fact, landlocked countries are known to be disadvantaged. And in the current configuration of countries, only 48 countries in the world are currently landlocked. Let me check if I have in the slides, probably not, but I have in the website a map. Here it is. Let me get it on the website. Just 1 second. Here we are. And here there is a map of the landlocked countries. They are 48. And they are known to be, as I said, disadvantaged. Furthermore, keep in mind that the coasts and the areas that are close to the coasts are extremely diverse ecosystems with a delicate equilibrium that plays a fundamental role for marine life and therefore sea protection and restoration. These are also additional resources. The presence of ecosystems that have a value, they are essential resources for the development of a country. Okay, so how can we define then a coastline? It is the boundary between the sea and the land, of course. This is also very perceptional, very straightforward. The coastline is the boundary between the sea and the land, but this boundary is not fixed. So we have to specify also the tide level. Conventionally, we identify the coastline in correspondence of the high tide mark. Okay, and this is also very very sensible because, you know, the seawater is salted, and where the seawater reaches the land, then the competition with vegetation starts. Usually you have ecosystems over the beach, but usually over the beach, we will define later on what a beach is, we don't have vegetation for the presence of the salt. And therefore, it is sensible that we locate the coastline in correspondence of the high tide mark. The shape of the coastline cannot be precisely determined because it depends on the scale of representation of the maps that you use. And in fact, there is a nice, to some extent, also amusing paradox that emerges when talking about the length of the coastline. The length of the coastline depends on the scale of representation. So if you take a coarse map, then you measure the length of the coastline and you get a number. If you refine the detail of the map, if you pass to a more detailed scale, then you get a longer extension of the coastline. And therefore, it's not possible to define precisely what the length of the coastline is. And the paradox concludes that the length of the coastline tends to infinity for increasing level of detail of the map. Now, we are not really interested in the coastline paradox because there is a link to a Wikipedia page in my website. But we are very interested instead on the evolution of the coastline, on the mechanisms that govern the evolution, which is driven by fluvial sediment transport. Fluvial sediment transport brings sediment to the sea, and erosion caused by waves. There are these two drivers that are competing. There is an increase, there is a flux of sediments coming from the land, going into the ocean, and there is a forcing operated by the waves, by the ocean, in order to displace this flux of sediment within the ocean in a way that limits the disequilibrium. And, you know, natural systems tends to reach an equilibrium that minimizes the instability of their state. So if you have a flux of sediment coming from the land and the sediment accumulate in the proximity of the coastline, then you get instability of the ocean bottom. And for the effect of the waves, these sediments tend to be displaced where there is less accumulation. And for instance, if you think at a river mouth, you have a substantial accumulation of sediments at the river mouth, and then these sediments are brought by along-shore sediment transport in places where there is less accumulation because there are no rivers bringing sediments into the sea. It's a continuous interaction of forces that shape the form of the coastline. Now, there are several ways, several criteria proposed by the literature to classify coastline. Why it is important classification in general in the analysis of natural processes. You may find the answer thinking that science has been traditionally based on classification. Think of classification of minerals, classification of fossils, because by classification, you get a useful information to understand the processes that you are interested in. So if I am interested in the evolution, in the processes that shape the cost line, classification helps me to understand what these processes are. A coast line may be formed by fluvial deposition or may be formed by erosion by the sea, different processes. And then I am expecting a different shape of the coastline. And in order to understand these shapes, the classification is useful. Now, this is why I focus when I teach on classification. And so talking about coastlines, to classify, their forms, we can use criteria that can be divided broadly in two categories: descriptive criteria, which are based on morphological or lithological parameters, and genetic criteria, which are based on the identification of the process that led to the formation of the coast shape. Let's discuss a little bit more about this classification. And let me give an example of a first descriptive criteria. And this descriptive criteria allows us to divide the coast forms in two categories. We can identify the cliffed coast, which is originated by erosion by the sea. And therefore, these coasts are typically dominated by rocky formations, are dominated by steep slopes or vertical slopes in some cases. So there is a highly sloping or even a vertical transition between the land and the sea. And the cliffed coast is often characterized by the presence of pocket beaches, which are located typically in correspondence of the estuary of rivers, even small rivers, small creeks. And the pocket beaches are a nice feature, a very interesting feature of cliff coasts, because for their diversity with respect to the surrounding environment, they typically host very interesting ecosystems, ecosystems with a value, and also they are very interesting for tourism. So the counterpart of the cliffed coast is the flat coast. The flat coast is originated by deposition, and it has a very mild slope. Think of the region here close to Ravenna, to the coastline close to Ravenna. It has been formed by deposition by the Po River, deposition of sediments from the Alps, from the north of Italy. And therefore, this deposition brings to the formation of shapes that are characterized by mild slopes. Deposition doesn't origin a rocky formation in the short term, in the short geological term. The flat coast is, of course, very diversified with respect to the cliffed coast. It's a completely different environment. Very often, also, the land in correspondence of the flat coast is it's an alluvial land. So it is characterized by the presence of aquifers. Aquifers that interact, aquifers of fresh water that interact with the salt water of the sea, and therefore they represent a delicate equilibrium between fresh water and salt water in the underground. So the flat coast, of course, is dominated by beaches, which are defined as this is an important definition: accumulation of loose sediments of varying size and type. The shape and the forms of the beaches are mainly determined by mechanical forcing, fluvial deposition, and waves, wind erosion, etc. We will discuss in detail about this. Okay, let me make a 15 minutes break now. And if you have any question, you can step in now. Otherwise, I am in the break. I am turning off the camera and the micro. I'm not turning off the registration of the video. It means that in the video, you will find 15 minutes of silence included. I prefer not to turn off the video because it is easier for me and for you to refer to a unique video for each lecture. Okay, see you around 4 p.m. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. See you later.
Okay, here we are. So,
Okay, prof.
grazie. Thank you. So let's continue with the cost line classification, and another criteria to classify the cost line divides the costs between emergent costs and submergent costs. The difference is that emergent costs may be originated by an uplift of the land or a decrease of sea level. And they are characterized in terms of forms by the presence of rocky cliffs and flat platforms, because you have to think at a morphology like the bottom of the sea level. And the bottom of the sea level indeed is characterized by flat platforms. And just one second, mi dica.
Potrei una consulta al tecnico?
Sì, prego, non c'è problema. Okay, sorry, student. And you have to think at the sea bottom, the shape of the sea bottom, because indeed the emergent coast it was previously a sea bottom that emerged. The submergent coasts instead are created by a raise of the sea level or land subsidence. And the form is very different because the submergent coast is given by river valleys that were inundated. So they are characterized by slopes. They are characterized by deep penetration of the ocean into the land. I think that it may be good to look at some pictures at this stage. And just one second, here I go here. This is the Chesapeake Bay in Delaware, and the Delaware Bay, the Chesapeake Bay is at the center, and the Delaware Bay is in the upper right. And it's the Atlantic coast of the central eastern United States. And this is a picture taken by the satellite. This is a typical example of a submergent coast. You see clearly that there is the penetration of the sea into what was previously a land, and the water, the salt water, is going up along the river valleys. It is the difference between emergent coast and submergent coasts is not only in their shape, but also there is a difference in the ecosystems. There is a big difference because in the case of the submergent coast, like the Chesapeake Bay, we have an ecosystem that was previously fed by fresh water that has been now invaded by salt water. But on the coast, there is still a lot of vegetation, which is a remain of the previous, more extended vegetation. And therefore, you see a lot of green around the sea. In correspondence of the emergent coasts, instead you have salted land, which means that there is less vegetation. Of course, after a long time, the beach, the vegetation recovers, even in the presence of salted soil, but this requires a long time, and typically the difference is clearly visible for a long period. In fact, the Chesapeake Bay is a protected environment. It's a protected environment where they are investing substantial economic resources for keeping the environment in its optimal shape and efficiency. I think there is a video linked here about which we could just watch for some seconds about the actions that they are now taking at the Chesapeake Bay in order to preserve the environment. Let me see if I can find it. In any case, I just wanted to suggest to you to watch it because it's short and it's interesting. It gives an idea of the action that can be taken for protecting the ecosystem of beaches. Just let me it's otherwise because I don't want to look at it today, but I just wanted to make sure. Okay, it's here. It's here. Let me open just a little bit for a few seconds, and here it is 2 minutes, but we are not going to watch now the whole duration. Let me just mute it. Okay, and so you see here, it's interesting to see what they are doing to monitor the environment, to monitor, for instance, the level of salt in the water. You see that the beach has a lot of vegetation here, and you see the vegetation that is going almost into the sea, and this is a prerogative, a feature of this type of coasts. And okay, just wanted to mention this video. Perfect. Now let me go back to the PowerPoint here, and let's talk about, here is the picture, and let's talk about just a few seconds. The beaches are extremely important environments for their social function, economic function. We already mentioned this. And keep in mind that they are extremely vulnerable because they are exposed to salt water, they are exposed to spray, they are exposed to erosion by sea waves, they are exposed to the effect of climate change, and they are exposed also to other anthropogenic forcings like the use of beaches for tourism and etc. It is an environment that has been recognized as extremely important and vulnerable. And I think there is a lot of opportunities for engineers to cooperate in an interdisciplinary setting for contributing to solving what is considered to be a global challenge today. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, there is a lot dedicated to oceans, seas, and if you look at the program of the European Community, Blue Growth, it focuses on monitoring the sea environment, monitoring the state of our oceans and seas. So I think it is indeed something that is under development and interesting for students. Now, I skip this and I close this lecture with a brief mention to the problem of saltwater intrusion. Saltwater intrusion is particularly concerning in correspondence of flat coasts, the coasts that are located in correspondence of alluvial lands. I already mentioned that alluvial lands are characterized by a significant permeability, and permeability means that we have a flux of fresh water coming from the land because the land is more elevated with respect to the sea. So from the land, you have rainfall, and therefore there is a natural flux of water from the land to the sea. And this takes place through surface water and through groundwater. So in the land side, you have a flux of fresh water in the underground, which is releasing freshwater input to the ocean, like for rivers. By the way, the flux, the groundwater flux, the ground freshwater flux to the ocean has been recognized as an important driver of climate, which is still poorly monitored. It's still poorly monitored because, of course, while we can monitor rivers with some difficulties, it's not so easy even to monitor rivers, but it is much more difficult to monitor groundwater fluxes. So you have this flux of groundwater toward the ocean. On the other hand, from the ocean side, there is a push of salt water to get into the land. And therefore, there is a kind of competition. Keep in mind that salt water is heavier than fresh water. The weight of fresh water is, as we know, 1 ton per cubic meters, so 1,000 kilograms per cubic meters. The weight of salt water on average is 1024 kilograms per cubic meters. There is a significant difference. And therefore, there is in the underground this competition. Of course, salt water from the ocean intrudes a little bit. If you look at the shape that you see on the screen, it's clear that if the seafloor is permeable, and it is permeable in a flat coast, flat alluvial coast, of course, the salt water that is above the seafloor tends to penetrate into the ground. And then there is the competition with the flux of fresh water. And this competition ends up with a kind of interface, which is depicted here as a sudden interface. Actually, there is a dispersion zone, so there is a mixing zone, but it is convenient here to depict it as a sudden interface. And of course, it wins the water that is higher in level, and fresh water has to be a little bit higher than necessary because it's lighter in weight. And what is the moral of the story? If for some reason you have a decrease of the freshwater flux from the land, then there is an increase of the extension of the saltwater wedge, which is clearly to be expected if the level of fresh water, the level of the water table, you see the water table here on the left, the level of the water table. If the level of the water table decreases, then it means that the fresh water has less energy and therefore loses some ground in this competition. Keep in mind that the water table can decrease not only for reduced rainfall, for instance, reduced water input over the land, which can be caused by climate change, by the way, but there are other anthropogenic drivers that can reduce the push of fresh water from the land, like, for instance, groundwater abstraction. If we take water from the underground, we reduce the volume of underground water, we reduce then the energy, and of course, we may witness an advance of salt water. Keep in mind that once an aquifer is contaminated by salt water, it is lost, meaning that it is not possible to quickly recover the underground from the salt. And the salt water cannot be used for irrigation, cannot be used for drinking. It is basically a very important resource that we may lose. Saltwater intrusion is a problem here in the coast of the Emilia-Romagna region, which is a permeable coast, and there is also a massive use of water, both surface water and groundwater, for civil purposes, civil and agricultural purposes. So this is indeed something that needs to be monitored. Okay. Now we stop here with this PowerPoint because the continuation is dedicated to coastal hydrodynamics and morphodynamics, which I don't want to discuss now because it's maybe in the future, maybe in the continuation of our course, but not now. Okay, so we can close this and we can go back to our introductory page and list of links. And the next link is port planning and environmental impact, which is interesting. And let me take the PowerPoint. Just 1 second. Okay. Okay, perfect. So, port planning and environmental impact. Here we are getting into Harbour Engineering indeed. We are getting into the preparation phase of our design process, which you know, it's needed for realizing ports and harbors. On the other hand, we need a proper preparation, a proper collection of information, a proper information gathering in order to understand and predict the interaction between the port activities and the environment. This is why we also made a premise on the value and functioning of beaches. Now, port planning is an essential phase of the design process. Port planning requires a consultation with stakeholders, first of all, which are the municipalities, the national government, the local authorities, like, for instance, the local port authority, which may require an extension of some facilities, and requires also a preliminary load estimation. If we are working on an extension of an existing port, of course, we may rely on existing measurements, and it should also be based on a preliminary design of structures. And usually the way the design process is articulated in Italy is precisely through a preliminary design, which allows to determine the essential features of the project. These essential features allow us to be able to make a cost estimate, a first cost estimate. It always happens that the first cost estimate is usually excessively optimistic. It is usually increased when we pass to the final phase of the process, of the design process. Also, the preliminary design allows us to make an environmental impact assessment, which is required when the infrastructures exceed predetermined sizes that are fixed by law. So when, for instance, we build water reservoirs, to make an example that is not related to the coastline, when the storage of the reservoir exceeds a predefined amount, then we need to make the environmental impact assessment. The environmental impact assessment, along with the preliminary design and the cost estimate, it's usually approved by an authority, depending on the regional laws, depending on the importance of the project, depending on the responsible authorities. And after the approval of the relevant authority, we can make the final design. As I said, the final design often ends up with a cost estimate that is larger with respect to the preliminary design. keep in mind that I already talked about the extensions, the enlargement of existing infrastructures, of existing port facilities. In fact, many ports all over the world are faced with a lack of space, a lack of room, and as a result of increased traffic, increased use for different purposes of the port facilities. And therefore, it is quite frequent that we see projects related to extensions of existing facilities. The fact that many ports are overloaded also emphasizes the important role of logistics. Of course, when there is an overload of traffic, one way of mitigating the problem is to optimize the traffic itself, and therefore the study of logistic of port operations, of port management is an extremely important topic in harbour engineering. Now, from a typically engineeristic point of view, the load estimation is an essential phase, and it is what we will focus on. Load estimation for berths, for wharves, for piers, for any infrastructure that is connected to the port. So a berth is a structure in ports and harbors where a vessel can be moored, where a ship can be moored. Mooring means fixing the ship to the land, to the berth, which in turn is connected to the land. And usually the purpose is loading or unloading passengers or goods of various typology. Berths are managed by a responsible body, usually is the port authority. A berth structure is exposed to a high number of loads. So the purpose of this lecture is to, first of all, gain an idea, an overview of the different loads that can insist over a berth structure, and then we will pass to estimation. What are the loads, the types of loads that we need to consider? We can classify, again, the usefulness of classification. We can classify them into three categories. Loads from the seaside, loads on the berth, direct loads on the berth, and loads from the land side. Also, loads can be divided into normal loads and extreme loads, also called live loads or accidental loads. Normal loads refer to the day-to-day use of the berth, like the self-weight or the loads that can be caused by very frequent forcings. And extreme loads instead occur exceptionally in exceptional situations. They are infrequent and can be of different types. But given that they are infrequent, they are unlikely to occur at the same time, while normal loads are expected to occur with high likelihood also at the same time. The extreme loads usually, as I said, do not superimpose each other unless there is dependence. And this is something extremely important, because we will see that the concomitance, the co-occurrence of extreme loads is something that we need to consider, because they are extreme, and therefore, even if unlikely, they can cause a high damage if they occur, and significantly more important damage if they superimpose. Now, when can they superimpose? By chance. Let's think, for instance, at the superimposition of a load that is derived from an earthquake and from extreme sea waves. These are largely independent each other. They can co-occur by chance, but this chance is very limited. There are other loads that are dependent, that may be dependent, like extreme waves and an unusually large number of ships moored with high load, with high weight, because it is the two things, the two occurrences are connected. It is likely that during extreme conditions, extreme marine conditions, the ships are forced to approach a berth and to moor. So these two situations are dependent. Dependence means that they can co-occur, and therefore dependence is extremely important. In the two examples that I made, the absence of dependence in the case of earthquake plus extreme waves, or the presence of dependence in the case of extreme waves and large number of ships moored, these two cases are quite trivial, quite obvious. It is very easy to decipher the absence of dependence in the first case and the presence of a strong dependence in the second phase. But for other type of co-occurrences, the interpretation may be more difficult, may be more subtle, and therefore we have to pay a lot of attention, because as we will see, we are allowed by some rules in force, some laws in force, to assume that extreme events are to some extent independent, unless we can gain some evidence of dependence. So it is extremely important that we are careful when assuming, and sometimes we need to assume, that extreme loads are not co-occurring, because indeed co-occurrence is maybe extremely unlikely, but may cause what is called the presence of a Damocles sword over our heads. Okay, now how to estimate these loads? It is extremely, of course, it's an essential step for an engineer to get information on what are the procedures that we are required to use, what are the procedures that we are suggested to use, or what are the procedures that we may sensibly use. And therefore, we need to refer to standards, guidelines, and formal regulation with an increasing level of importance of these regulation. So standards are something useful that we may be not strictly required to follow. Guidelines are not formal regulation, but if they are present, if they are known, it may be wise to follow them, more than wise, maybe ethically correct to follow them. Formal regulation are laws in force, are imposed by laws in force. It is something that we are required to follow. It is not easy to get oriented into this set of standards, guidelines, and formal regulations. The formal regulations can be issued by a national authority, by an international authority, by a local authority. For instance, port authorities may require to adhere to some formal regulations. And therefore, we need to get, when we approach design effort, when we get committed to design a port or an harbor, the first thing that we have to do is to get information on these standards, guidelines, and regulations. And if we are working in an international setting, it is not really easy. And in some cases, we have formal regulations that are promoted, for instance, by the Spanish authorities. And if we go to work in a country, in another Mediterranean country, there might be a less restrictive regulation. But the fact that on the same sea, another country has a stricter regulation might be considered, because the fact that they do not directly apply because we are in another jurisdiction, anyway, does not excuse us if we ignore them. Because it's clear that we have, as we act as engineers, to follow common sense, to follow the best practices that we can gain with the best of our knowledge. So it is extremely important, especially for designing infrastructures like ports that have an international perspective, like airports. They basically are infrastructures that work in an international context. And also the ports is the same thing. It is extremely important that we get an overview of the rules that are suggested by different authorities in different contexts. And this is why I'm referring also in my web pages to rules of the Spanish authorities, I refer to other national rules. And so this is the first step. And then also we have to carefully consider the safety factors. Why safety factors? Of course, we are engineers, we know what is the meaning of a safety factor. But keep in mind, from a conceptual point of view, an interesting perspective. The safety factor allows to account for uncertainty. And when there is uncertainty, first, keep in mind that engineering is always affected by uncertainty. Our design processes are never deterministic, are never precise. They leave some room to uncertainty, which is fine. And this is why we introduce the safety factors. On the other hand, what does uncertainty means? Or let's say, what is causing uncertainty? There are many reasons, but uncertainty is also caused by randomness. And when we design ports, an important forcing is random, is given by waves, or is given by traffic, is given by the traffic of ships, which is a random process. Randomness means that there is part of the process, at least part of the process, that cannot be predicted, and therefore it means uncertainty. So uncertainty is certainly present when designing a port, like it is present when designing a building, but I would say that ports are maybe the emblem of uncertainty, because the forcing comes from waves, and the waves are really random processes, are processes where randomness is emphasized. And therefore, we have to be careful of randomness, casuality of the loads, which means that safety factors have to be carefully evaluated. And we have to be aware of the responsibility of the engineer. When we make mistakes, we are responsible for it. And this is something that I frequently repeat to my scientific colleagues. I have interaction with the scientific community. This is needed nowadays, because of the continuous development of science. And I always emphasize that, I am very keen to emphasizing that the role of the engineers entails bearing a responsibility for what we do. The scientist is less responsible. The scientist is allowed to make mistakes. The engineer is not allowed to make mistakes. When we make a mistake, we are, in most of the cases, prosecuted, and we have to demonstrate that the mistake was not our fault. So we have to be fully aware of the responsibility, especially when dealing with random processes, uncertain processes. So let me just read this quote from Thoresen. Thoresen, I want to show you this reference because it is extremely interesting. So let me see, where is it? Available online. You know that I am a fanatic of free education. So let me, I think there is, okay. Okay, I think I should have started a new line here. Thoresen, Port Designers Handbook. Let me just check if it's available on the web. Okay, Port Designer Handbook recommendation. It's a PDF, you see. Let's click on this. This is an interesting reference. It is, it is a long one. It's 500 pages. Let's look at the table of contents. Introduction, planning procedures, resolution to start planning, selection of consulting engineers, scope of work, registration of users, etc., etc. Let's see, chapter 2, environmental forces, so environmental loads, wind forces, different wind standards, etc. Chapter 3, channels and harbor basins, and how to design an harbor basin, how to design the channels connecting the harbor basin, the turning areas, the berthing areas, berthing requirements, impact from ships. Beware, we will discuss only a few of these things because we don't need to focus on everything. Design consideration, design life, this is something that we will discuss. Safety consideration, design safety, construction safety, personal safety, types of berth structures, how to make underwater works, construction time, gravity wall structure, sheet pile wall structures. It is an important chapter of harbor engineering. Open berth structures, berth details, container terminals. So you see fenders, erosion protection, steel corrosion, underwater concreting, another interesting chapter, concrete deterioration, concrete repair, ship dimensions, conversion factors. Okay, so it is a huge discipline, which also involves some elements of structural mechanics, some elements of geotechnics. We will focus only on some of the loads, some of the loads coming from the sea, typically. So wind load, load due to tides, to currents, etc. And keep in mind that for most of it, harbor engineering is means empirical formulas. And these are physical processes, in some cases also chemical and biochemical processes. So in principle, we could describe these processes with the law of physics. But the fact that there is a complex interaction between different processes, sea waves, and then traffic of ships, and then sediment transport maybe, and then management, port management. And each of these processes affected by randomness, then the physically based description becomes very uncertain. And for this reason, it is often preferred the use of empirical formulas which implicitly take uncertainty into account. Why? Because empirical formulas are developed by by trial and error. So basically, we try an empirical formula, it's wrong, and then we try another one, it's a little bit better, and then we try another one, it's really not working, and then another one. So with this trial and error procedure, we minimize the error, and the error is the result also from uncertainty. And therefore, the empirical formulas often have, with respect to the physical interpretation, have a higher capability of adapting to uncertainty, of describing uncertainty. Because the physical description cannot describe what we don't know. So it's true that there is a way to make the physical description flexible, therefore empiricizing the physical description. On the other hand, it's also true that often the process becomes so complicated that engineers prefer to focus on the empirical formula, because the purpose of the engineer at the end of the story is the precision, is the rigor, is to minimize the possibility of making big mistakes. So much of the panorama on Harbour Engineering is dominated by empirical formulas. If you browse this book, you will see that there is an attempt to provide a physical interpretation, but very often you will find empirical formulas, and we will see some examples, okay? There is no need for us to go through 500 pages, but what I wanted to emphasize, to let you know, to point out, is the very reason why in Harbour Engineering we use a lot of empirical formulas. And this makes the study of Harbour Engineering more complicated, of course, because learning physical formula is relatively easier than learning empirical formulas. Why? Because there is a physical reasoning behind a physical law, and therefore learning it is easier. This is also why usually I skip some empirical formulas. I don't like really to teach a lot of empirical formulas, which we cannot remember, actually. It is very hard to remember this empirical formula. And therefore, I prefer, sometimes I need to show them, but I prefer to skip the very rigorous formulation, especially when they count a lot of coefficients. Okay, and I was saying, let's write now Thoresen, this quote from Thoresen, after having seen his book. In this book, which I just browsed very quickly, you can find this statement. Different countries have different regulations. All constructions have to be in accordance with the legislation in the country in which it is built. Many countries have their own standards for marine and coastal construction, but some do not. The designer has to find out whether or not there are national standards or guidelines that have to be used for design. If such national standards exist, they have to be used. And if national guidelines exist, it is recommended to use them. If no national legislation, standard, or guideline exists, the designer is not required to use specific design manuals, but it is highly recommended to use internationally accepted standards and guidelines instead of trying to create a specific guideline for the project. This is, I think these are very wise words, and they put in light first that, I mean, this preliminary collection of standards, guidelines, rule is essential. We must be very careful in it. This applies to any branch of engineering, but for Harbour Engineering, this operation, this step is particularly complex. To give you some example, international rules such as the Eurocodes and national regulations may give order of magnitude for safety, concurrency factors, and individual loads. And so it is extremely important that we get this order of magnitude. And it is extremely important that we get an international panorama, an international perspective. Good. Now, sorry. Loads. Here you see a scheme which I think it is particularly useful for getting an overview of the loads that can insist over a berth. Again, we can split them into three categories: from seaside, from berth, and from land side. From seaside, we have horizontal and vertical loads, and we have horizontal and vertical loads also in the other two categories. It is a common procedure to split the loads in these two categories, horizontal and vertical. Usually, the vertical loads are taken by the foundation of the berth, like the piles, for instance, while the horizontal loads usually are taken by the friction between the berth and the foundation / the soil. Okay. Of course, the piles, while they can bear very easily the vertical loads, they are weaker if forced by an horizontal load. Now, seaside, horizontal loads from sea, like waves, the waves can origin an horizontal load, or ice pressure. This is maybe extremely relevant, extremely heavy. Also, we can get horizontal loads from docking ships, given by ship impact and friction and bollard forces. So, what is a bollard? Anytime that you have a doubt on some terms, I am opening a parenthesis here. You may refer to, let me go back to the next lecture, Forcing Estimation for Harbour Design. Here, there is a link which I think is extremely interesting, the glossary of nautical terms. Let me click on this link. It's a Wikipedia page. I think it is very useful. So we wanted to see what is a bollard. Let's see under B. Let's go down, go down, go down. I hope it is there. Let's see. Bollard. Here, bollard. Oh, there is also the picture. You see, it is a very interesting page. A bollard, let's click on it. A bollard is, here there is the picture, is a sturdy, short, vertical post. And the term originally referred to a post on a ship or a quay used principally for mooring boats. Good, let's see the picture here. This is an example of a bollard. Okay, this link is extremely useful. Another way for getting information on a term, it is the always present Google. So if you just type bollard here, and then you click on images, you get several pictures of bollards. Bollards can be used also during the urban in the urban environment to avoid the access to roads, but in our specific context, the bollard is like this picture shows. It's a mooring point for a ship. Good. Let me close the parentheses and let's go back to the PowerPoint. So, bollard forces are an horizontal load. From ship at dock, we have as horizontal loads the bollard forces again. The wind against the ship causes an important load on the berth, and then we have waves, and then we have currents. Now, vertical loads from the seaside, we may have again bollard forces because the ship may also move up and down, thus causing vertical loads on the bollards. And we may have also vertical forces on fenders. Fenders, once again, let's see, just to make sure that you know what we are talking about. Here is the fender. It's a flexible bumper which is used to absorb the kinetic energy of a boat. They can be fixed to the boat, or in some cases they are fixed to the berth, like in this case. You see a cylindrical fender in an harbor. These are an essential element of berths in order to avoid damage when the ship are approaching the berth. Okay, good. Let's go back here. So the vertical forces on fenders can cause a vertical load, and then there are the ice forces which can also cause a vertical load. Now let's look at the loads acting on the berth structure from the berth itself. The horizontal loads are given by thermic dilatation, can be given by cranes. You know, the cranes are these big, how to call them, structures that are used to move the goods and to make sure that we understand each other. Let me get another web page. I'm sure you know what cranes are, but just to make sure, again, Google images. This is a crane. Okay. And the cranes, of course, they are widely used in berths, and especially, I mean, when in important berths, of course, and they can cause horizontal loads because they move typically. They move also the goods in the horizontal direction. And then, sorry for the Italian, then we have the wind force. We have the forces against curbs and friction forces. Curbs, just to make sure, again, that we understand each other's. Or I think that more than to curb means to break, basically. They are structures that are used in order to stop the movement of vehicles or movement of cranes. So, of course, the presence of curves origins horizontal loads, and then friction forces, for instance, by the tires when the trucks they brake. Of course, there are friction forces, horizontal loads given by trucks reducing their velocity. And then we have the vertical loads given by berth buildings and superimposed load, the self weight of the berth itself, and then the snow maybe, and the ice forces. From the land side, we will not consider these loads, but there are important horizontal loads given by soil filling, load on filling, and pore water load. Of course, when you have in the soil filling, you have pores, and when water is stored into the pores, it origins a load from the land over the berth. And then the vertical loads are given by soil filling and superimposed load on the soil filling. We will focus in particular on the loads from the seaside, so we will not concentrate much on the other loads. Good. This may be a question at the exam, type of loads and the classification of loads and what kind of loads do you remember? And it would be a descriptive, it could be a first question, a descriptive question, which requires a descriptive answer, and but could be very easily, it is likely that a question like this comes out. I already talked about combination, and so it is not easy to understand how to combine the loads, in particular the extreme loads. I already talked about dependence, and let's say something more, because this is a problem where the regulation may indeed play a key role. In fact, I suggest that you use the following guidelines. For the extreme loads, for sure, it is not required to consider all of them occurring at the same time. For sure, there are guidelines, standard regulation that suggest a kind of reduction with respect to the sum of all the extreme loads. In general, it is unlikely that two or more accidental loads occur together unless they are dependent. The seismic load usually is considered an accidental load when designing berths. So it's not a normal load. And then again, look at the international standards, look at the regulations. This is what you should look at. Now, design life, this is an important chapter. You know that in almost any of the design projects an engineer gets entertained, there is the question of deciding the design life, which means that if you design a structure for an expected life that is reduced, there is less probability that during this expected life, an accidental load is experienced. And therefore, typically, if a structure is a temporary one, like, for instance, something that is used only during construction works, usually we don't require a level of safety that is very high. So basically, this means that if you reduce the design life, you save money, and the structure is less impacting on the environment. So the design life has an important meaning, because it means efficiency, it means safety. Of course, if you reduce the design life, you are less safe against extreme events. It means responsibility. Fortunately, the design life in many of the cases is dictated by law in force, by regulations, which we have to adopt. And therefore, we really need also to get this piece of information. The design life is defined as the expected operational time for the port or for the single port structure. A general rule says that berth structures in commercial ports should have at least a design life of 50 years. So they should be designed with an expected life of at least 50 years or more. So for berth, here you can see some indications, which in my opinion are very useful to get a set of rules of thumb. For berths serving special industries, container traffic, oil traffic, a design life of about 30 years is often adopted. And why is that? Why less than 50? Because it is expected that the commercial traffic should undergo relevant changes in 30 years, which may require an adaptation, restoration, rebuilding of the facilities. So when we design for tourism, the moral of the story is that we take a design life that is generally longer. Good. Now, for flood protection works, usually the design life is higher. It's about 100 years. And why is that? Because, you know, flood protection entails also safety for the human lives. In general, a rule of thumb, which is not written here, but you should always keep it in mind, is that when the human life is at risk, when human lives are at risk, you have to increase your design life. And this is quite obvious. If the worst damage that you may expect is economic losses, you can take the risk because you save money. If you reduce the design life, you save money, so you may take the risk of losing money with a given probability. But of course, we cannot take the risk of exposing human lives. And therefore, flood protections are very often designed for a design life of at least 100 years for this very reason. And in most of the cases, we will have suggested design lives that are longer than 100 years. Also, we should consider that berth structures are highly exposed to corrosion. What does this mean? It may mean that they cannot stay there for 50 years. And therefore, this should be considered in the context of identifying the best design life that we should adopt. Of course, with the never-ending consideration of the risk for human lives. In general, keep this elementary, obvious suggestion in mind. In general, think of the impact of a failure and the consequences, the damage, the possible loss of lives, and adapt the design life to that. In some of the cases, you may even decide to adopt a design life that is larger than what the rule suggests because of what common sense is suggesting. You should never forget common sense. Some indications, some numbers. So for breakwaters, breakwater are, I think you know what they are structures that are placed in order to protect beaches from erosion and also to protect harbors from flooding because they basically stop the waves, they mitigate the impact of waves. So in some cases, they can also be considered a flood protection measure. 100 years of design life. Reinforced open berth structures, design life 50, 100 years. Steel sheet pile berth structure 50 years, because the sheet pile is a stronger structure with respect to an open berth structure. Rubber fenders, 10 years. Keep in mind that these need anyway to be changed after a while because they deteriorate quite quickly. Concrete aprons and roads, 20 years. Okay, here you see a spectrum, a set of design lives that can help you to get oriented to put into practice, into numbers, the general considerations that I made before. Now, let's start focusing on the type of berth structures. And we can distinguish between two main categories: wharfs and piers. Piers are perpendicular to the coastline, are displaced more or less perpendicular. Wharfs are aligned with the coastline. And basing on their structures, the berth and wharfs may be classified into two main categories: solid structure berths and open structure berths. Let's see some figures. Let me check here in my web pages. I think there are a couple of pictures. This is a crane, you see, on a berth. You can easily understand the amount of vertical and horizontal load that they can cause. These are sheet piles. This is a berth that is built, the vertical structure of the berth is built by using sheet piles. And the sheet piles, I think we understand each other's, but let me get some more images for sheet piles. You see how they are, and they are filled with land on the land side, and in this way you obtain a vertical structure in order to form the vertical wall of the berth. The purpose is to create a structure that is impermeable and is also capable of bearing weight. So it's a structure that can take loads, of course. Good. Let's go back here. Yeah, solid structure, open structure, I forgot. Just 1 second. This is an open structure berth. Basically, and open structure berths are built over maybe piles. The feature, the distinguishing feature is that water can run through the berth. And in this way, they oppose less resistance to waves and to forcing from the seaside. Let me see if there is, if there are some more pictures on the web, because on the web you find a lot of pictures and I cannot put all of them on my website. I can only put there those that are not copyrighted. Open structure berth. So this is frustrating because very often I find very nice pictures, but I cannot use them. So, for instance, let me see, what is the best one? Okay, I'm not sure this is a berth, probably yes, but I think, let me see if I can get, yeah, it's very small. I'm not sure it is a berth, probably yes, but you see this is completely open. This is an extreme example. And another, I think, another example is this picture here. I think this is an open structure berth, which allows the mooring of important ships, by the way. And then there is the solid structure berth. The solid structure berth is realized by first building a vertical wall and then filling on the land side, as I anticipated just a few minutes ago. And these structures can be divided into two subcategories: the gravity wall structure and the sheet pile structure. So the vertical wall can be created with a sheet pile or with a vertical wall. And of course, there are pros and cons for both the solutions in terms of expense of cost and in terms of ability to sustain loads. And the open berth structure is usually used for less important facilities, for less important piers or wharfs, while, of course, the solid berth structure is more frequently used for large facilities. And usually when heavy ships have to be moored, we work with solid structured berths. Okay, how should we select the most appropriate structure? By looking at several contextual features like soil condition, if underwater work is needed or not, the action of waves, the construction time, the equipment, the material, the cost, the flexibility, because we may want that a structure can be easily extended in size. So we usually look at all of these features. And as a rule of thumb, once again, I would like to give you the following guidelines. In order to understand what is the size of a berth, first of all, we have to get a perception of the order of magnitude of the size of these structures. So the length of the berth is varying usually from 5-10 meters for a small boat in a marina to over 400 meters for large ships. The large cruise ships may reach a length of more than 300 meters. The length of the berth should be roughly 10% longer than the longest vessel to be moored at the berth itself. This is a rough indication. The width of small docks, let's now focus on the width of the berth, should be at least a couple of meters for a ship length up to 10 meters. And a length of the pier or the wharf up to 100 meters. So this is the minimum width. The width should be increased to a minimum of 2.5 meters for ship length between 10 and 20 meters, and the dock length between 100 and 150 meters. The width should be minimum 3 meters for ship and width length exceeding the above limits. Okay, just to give you some ideas. When possible, the berth should be aligned with the dominant wind and dominant current, of course, because you don't want the wind bringing the ship to crash against the berth. It's much more easier to moor when the ship doesn't get the transverse wind, doesn't get the wind in the transverse direction, in the longitudinal It is easier to moor when the ship gets the wind in the longitudinal direction, along the longitudinal direction. In terms of structural loads, the berth should be designed against a live vertical load of at least 4 kilonewton per square meter. Higher loads may result from a detailed analysis. In terms of vertical positioning of the berth floor, meaning vertical difference between mean sea level and berth floor, it is recommended to make a specific assessment, which should take into account the kind of ships and the tide dynamics and so forth. A difference of at least 1 meter should be adopted. So the minimum elevation difference between the mean sea level and the berth floor should be 1 meter. Absolutely not less than that. Very frequently, more than that. Environmental impact, it is a relevant issue. you know, port construction and port operation brings an environmental impact that is very heavy. And environmental impact in terms of water quality in the port, not only because unavoidably ships release some oil, some litters. It is also a matter of limited circulation, limited exchange of water into the harbor. And also there is a urban expansion around the harbor, and therefore, you know, you have releases of sewer water, you have releases of pollution from the urban expansion. And also there is the logistic, the management of the port that is bringing a lot of vehicles, a lot of trucks, which means the collection of several pollutants over the berth structure, which then could, you know, it's washed into the sea. And also there is the sedimentation of muds in the bottom of the berth, where the exchange of water is the bottom of the harbor of the port, where the water exchange is limited, the water velocity is limited, and therefore there is sedimentation of muds, which are often highly contaminated because the harbor is a collector. Is a collector of all of these pollutants which I mentioned before. And this is why there is a lot of attention between authorities, by municipalities to the environmental impact of the port, especially if there is tourism in the vicinity, if there is a combination of several activities and concentration of population. So environmental impact is something that is important. We are not focusing much on it, but I want to really emphasize to students the opportunity of becoming experts about the environmental impact of harbor and ports. And I mean, it is also the environmental impact caused by the increase of CO2 emissions related to the port activities. That's okay, and next time I want to dedicate some time to the blue growth strategy of the European Union. I think it is highly relevant, and it is also an opportunity for you and for completing your education with an interesting digression on the strategic plans on the European Union to protect the sea and marine environment. Okay, I think we can stop here. Let me close the registration. I'm sorry that you were alone. It is not easy, but on the other hand, I want to again tell you, don't be concerned if you have to leave during a lecture in which you are alone. This is perfectly fine. In any case, I would lecture even if you were not there. So thank you very much, and see you next Wednesday.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you. See you
Bye-bye.
next week. Bye-bye.